Intergenerational trauma.
What is intergenerational trauma? Intergenerational trauma occurs when trauma from colonialism and residential schools is passed down through generations. After the original generation experienced the trauma, they returned home and were expected to live life without tools, knowledge, skills, or experience to cope. Trauma is passed through biological, sociocultural, and psychological avenues. Sociocultural model. This model focuses on the parenting styles and how environmental surroundings and how those two things contribute to the transmission of trauma and impede on child development. Children learn by watching their parents. If parents never learn appropriate coping skills, the child will not either. When abuse, neglect, and/or stress is experienced, the children are unable to develop and build healthy coping skills. This becomes a community norm in some cases when the majority of families lack appropriate coping strategies, thus the cycle continues. When unhealthy coping strategies become community norm, it is difficult to amend, especially when communities are geographically isolated. Psychological model. This theory focuses on parents' attachment to their children and the parent's ability to instinctually know what their child needs. Early brain development depends on parents knowing what their infant requires. It is important for self-regulation and healthy brain development. Developmental delays and poor coping skills could result in which directly impact the child's success in their school and social life. The physiological model. This theory focuses on epigenetics, genetics, and predisposed mental illness. Toxic stress and raised cortisol levels can disrupt brain and organ development that can cause stress-related diseases and cognitive impairment later in life. Maternal stress can cause epigenetic changes in the fetus that will affect their genes. Toxic stress, when a child experiences strong, frequent, or prolonged adversity, such as physical or emotional abuse, chronic neglect, caregiver substance abuse, or mental illness, exposure to violence, and or accumulate burdens of family economic hardships without adequate support.
Who does it impact? Intergenerational trauma goes beyond the individual. It affects families and communities of Indigenous peoples and spans across all of Canada's First Nations. Intergenerational trauma is the direct result of the difficult and inhumane social conditions Indigenous communities in Canada have faced and are facing. Mental health and addiction problems in Indigenous communities. Considering Indigenous mental health and substance abuse issues as a direct result of historical injustice, we begin to change the narrative and stereotypes surrounding the Indigenous culture. Alcoholism, child abuse, suicide, and domestic violence. Indigenous communities experience these issues at a greater capacity than the national average. How does intergenerational trauma affect Indigenous peoples' well-being? There is a disproportionate number of individuals that suffer from mental health conditions in Indigenous communities than in the general population of Canada. Many mental health conditions that Indigenous people face are a direct result of intergenerational trauma. Indigenous peoples experience mental health challenges on a larger scale than the general population, and Indigenous people have a higher rate of suicide compared to the national average, as high as 70% in Indigenous communities. Indigenous youth are also 6 times more likely to use alcohol underage than a non-Indigenous person.
Residential schools. Residential schools opened in 1831 and continued to run until 1996. These facilities were government funded and ran by churches with the intent to amalgamate Indigenous youth into Canadian society. Children were taken away from their homes, separated from their siblings, forbidden to practice their culture or speak their own language. Upon arrival, their hair was cut and their traditional clothing replaced with a uniform. The 60 Scoop. The 60 Scoop took place from 1961 to 1980. The 60 Scoop was a mass removal of Indigenous children from their families and communities and placed into the child welfare system. These children were placed in an environment surrounded by people who were not qualified to work with children from Indigenous communities. This 60 Scoop was an attempt to deny Indigenous peoples of their culture, diet, language, and many other sacred practices. The Millennial Scoop. Although there have been adjustments made to the child welfare system since the 60 Scoop, there is an alarming percentage of Indigenous children in permanent care. Many children continue to be removed from their families and environment and experience enormous amounts of abuse. The reasoning for this is claimed to be neglect, even though the rates of physical abuse and partner violence is higher in non-Indigenous households. Colonialism. When the Europeans came to North America, they were under the impression it was nobody's land and everybody should practice their same laws and religion. Land was seized and settlers controlled the Indigenous access to resources and trades. These laws forced Indigenous peoples to be dependent on the settlers. The Europeans brought diseases which killed many Indigenous people because they had not previously been exposed to diseases to build immunity. Despite all the hardships Indigenous people have faced, they have still chosen to stay strong in their faith and continue to fight for what they deserve.